Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and this is the second part of my functional biblical Greek course. I got a little bit of a positive response from the first one, and so I'm taking that as an indication that people would like to see a little bit more. And this course is not designed to necessarily make you an expert in Greek or anything like that, but hopefully to help you be able to use resources, give you a basic understanding, and hopefully give you enough background to keep yourself out of trouble, at least to a certain extent. But more than anything, I just hope that people find it useful and helpful to their faith in general. These Greek courses include the PowerPoint which you're seeing now, and of course a little bit of notes that I have on it. So if you want, you can go ahead and look at the video description, expand that out, and you should see a link that'll take you to a file that contains the PowerPoint and also some notes, just in case you want to have something that you can keep on hand, something that's a little bit more permanent. And as far as other resources and things that I would suggest that you take a look at my first video, because in my first video I cover suggested resources and things like that. Alright, so with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, so Lecture 2, Bare Essentials. We're going to talk about some really basic things today. If you're absolutely new to Koine Greek, it's probably not going to seem all that basic, just to be honest, but it is fairly basic compared to all the things that you're going to talk about. We're going to talk about things like the Greek alphabet. We're going to talk about what the rough breathing mark is. We're going to talk about Greek diphthongs. We're going to talk about Greek punctuation. And we're also going to talk about Greek syllabification. And we're also going to translate one verse when we're done. Just like in the first one, we translated one verse, John 11:35, which is pretty simple to translate, pretty short. We're also going to try to translate a verse in this one as well. Alright, so that's an overview of where we're going. Let's go ahead and get into this. So our first thing that we're going to tackle is the Greek alphabet. Alright. As I said the first time, I include some blanks on some of the some of the slides, just so that people have something to do while they're listening. You know, write things down, that sort of thing. Helps people pay attention a little bit more. Alright, so first thing that you need to know is that the Greek alphabet is composed of 24 letters, too shy of how many we have in English, 24 letters. Now of those letters, 7 are vowels, so it's a very vowel-heavy language by comparison. Also, the pronunciation that we will be learning is called the Erasmian pronunciation. This is like Erasmus of Rotterdam type Erasmian, and this is the standard in biblical studies. Now, just because this is the standard in biblical studies and the one that you typically use, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the most accurate. Koine Greek is a dead language, and frankly nobody really knows exactly how it was pronounced. The one thing that people are pretty sure of, though, is that the Erasmian pronunciation is probably not correct. However, since it is the standard in biblical studies, and if you go to most seminaries and Bible colleges and whatnot, they're going to use this, I've decided to go ahead with that pronunciation. And frankly, my pronunciation isn't perfect anyways, and that's the nice thing about a dead language, is your pronunciation doesn't have to be correct. So don't freak out too much, but we still have to have some pronunciation just so that we can actually talk about things and say things. And so that's why we have the system in the first place. It's a dead language, so in one sense it doesn't matter, but in the sense of being able to communicate with each other about it and talk about the language, you need to have something to go with. And so that's where the Erasmian pronunciation comes in. Alright, so we're going to take that alphabet of 24 letters and we're going to split it up into groups of 4. The first 4 letters, which I call the primaries, are as follows. The first one is called alpha, and it sounds like the A in father. Alpha, father, ah. And this is kind of interesting in that it's a little bit different than English. In English, we really like ah sounds, like hat and cat and bat, but Greek, at least in the Erasmian pronunciation, doesn't have that. Instead, it's more of an ah sound. So it's alpha. Not alpha, but alpha. The second letter is beta. And it has a B sound, just like Bible. B, b, b. Beta. And this is actually where we get the English word alphabet from. It literally comes from alpha, beta, alphabet. In English, we say our ABCs, and in Greek, you say your alpha, betas. So the first letter is alpha, second letter is beta. That's very similar to English. The third one, though, throws people for a loop because it is not like English. Normally in English, you would expect a C to come here. And there are letters in Greek that sound like the English C, but this is not one of them. This one's a little bit different. You have alpha, you have beta, and then you have gamma. And it is normally like a G kind of sound, like in gone, g, g, gamma. However, in some cases, it will sound more like an N, as an angel. N, angel, n. And the way that you can tell when it sounds like one and when it sounds like the other is that in most cases it's going to sound like a G. It's going to sound like the G in gone. However, if it's followed by another gamma or anything that makes kind of a C sound, like kappa, ki, or xi, any of those kinds of sounds that have kind of a C sound to them, then you pronounce it as the N in angel. So most of the time it's a G sound, sometimes it's an N sound depending on what follows it. And then the last one of the primaries is delta. And it sounds like the D in dog. Okay. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. When you're first learning Greek, I would suggest that you prioritize looking at the lowercase letters, because in a standard Greek in a standard edition of the Greek New Testament, most of the letters are going to be lowercase letters, and so that's what you're going to have to know more than anything else. However, it is helpful to know the capitals, and so I put those in there as well, and they're also in the notes as well, but focus mostly on the lowercase letters. Alright, so now we've learned a few of the letters. Now let's sound out some words. Now these words are not Greek words, and frankly they're not even good English words, but it's still nice to get a little bit of practice in. So the first letter that we have down, first word that we have down at the bottom is a three-letter word, and the letters are beta, alpha, and gamma. Gamma. Beta has a B sound. Alpha has an A sound. And then gamma has a G sound. So it's B-A-G. Ba-A-G. Bog. Bog. I guess it's kind of an English word. Talk like a boggy, marshy area. Bog. And this would make a great English word bag, but the A sound doesn't exist in the Erasmian pronunciation, so it's not bag, it's bog. Alright, let's take a look at the second word. We have, again, a three-letter word. There's delta, alpha, and beta. Delta has a D sound, D. Alpha has an A sound, and then beta has a B sound. So D-A-B, D-A-B, dob, dob. Not exactly sure what kind of a word that would be, because it's not really Greek, it's not really English, but hey, it's there. Dob. Maybe it's kind of like dab, dob the dab, I don't know. But you have bog, and you have dob. Alright, the next four letters I call the epsiatas. And they have some related endings in the way that you say them. The first one is kind of different. It's epsilon, and it sounds like the E in met. It's an S sound, epsilon. Now when you're looking at the screen, you'll notice that I have three forms that are up there for it. There's two capital forms and one lowercase form, and like I said, most of what you need to focus on is the lowercase form. However, the capital forms are interesting just depending on what you're looking at. In most modern writing, a capital epsilon looks like a capital E in English. However, if you're looking at ancient writings, epsilon basically looks like a C with a line through the middle of it. So it's a little bit a different thing. And I just find that kind of to be an interesting how letters will change through the ages. So capital epsilon used to be basically a half circle with a line, and it eventually became what we would recognize as a capital E. Alright, and then after epsilon is zeta. And zeta has a Z sound, as in days, days, zeta. And then the next two letters rhyme with zeta, and so that makes it a little bit easier to remember. So you have epsilon, zeta, and then the next two letters are eta and theta. So epsilon, zeta, eta, theta. Epsilon, zeta, eta, theta. Eta, its capital form looks kind of like a capital H, but the lowercase form looks like a lowercase n with a tail. And it has a long A sound, as in obey, a, eta. And then the last one, theta, has a TH sound like thing, theta. Alright, so epsilon, zeta, eta, theta. Let's sound out some words. So down at the bottom we have a couple of three-letter words again, and these ones are a little bit better English analogs. The first one is beta, epsilon, theta. Beta has a B sound, epsilon has an E sound, and theta has a th sound. So B, E, th, B, E, th, Beth, Beth. Like the name Beth, or Bethany, or Bethlehem. Beth. The second three-letter word is delta, eta, zeta. Delta has a D sound, eta has an A sound, and then zeta has a Z sound, Z. So it's D, A, Z, D, A, Z, days. So we have Beth and days. Beth is in a daze, I don't know. Alright, let's go ahead and move forward. Alright, the next four letters I call the skip J's because they are almost identical to what you would expect in English, starting with the English letter I, but you skip J. Greek doesn't really have a J, and in fact a lot of the ancient languages don't have really anything that has that just sound that you have in English. Instead, that would usually be given over to whatever corresponded to I, which in Greek is iota. And sometimes it does kind of take the place of a J, but when it takes the place of a J in an ancient language, it usually comes out as more of a Y sound, a Y sound. And this is something that usually occurs mostly with Semitic names. For example, Jesus' name in Greek is Jesus. There's a Y sound in it. It's spelt with iota, but because of the Semitic root, it's more of a Jesus kind of sound. Although there are some people who would pronounce it Jesus, which is kind of a weird way of pronouncing it. And then there's also the Greek name for John. If you're going to be a purist and pronounce it only with the Erastian pronunciation, you would pronounce it Ioannes. Ioannes. However, if you allow for the Semitic origin of it, it'd be more like Ioannes. Ioannes. So iota can kind of function as a J. However, in standard Greek words, it sounds like the I is in intrigue. It's either an I sound, intrigue, or it's an E sound, trigue, in, or trigue. I, E, I, E. And if it's in a Semitic origin word at the beginning of the word, sometimes it has more of a yes sound. Okay. But the rest of the letters are basically what you would expect in English. After I, we don't have J because J doesn't exist in the Greek. So after I, J is kind of a part of the I, you'd expect K, L, and M. And that's basically what you have. You just have the Greek forms of them. So instead of K, you have something that looks a lot like a K. It's called kappa. And it basically sounds like the K. Like in kitchen. Kappa. And then after K, you would expect L. And the next letter does basically have the L sound like in law, but it's not called L, it's called lambda. 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 And then the next letter you would expect to be M, and it does have an M sound like in mother, but it's not called M, it's called mu. So, iota kappa lambda mu. Iota kappa lambda mu. Iota kappa lambda mu. Let's go ahead and pronounce some words. Alright, so the next word that we have to pronounce is a 4-letter word. That is pretty fantastic. It is mu, iota, lambda, kappa. Mu has an M sound, m. Iota can be either an I or an E sound. For this one, we're going to do the I sound. Lambda has an L sound, l, l. And then kappa has a K sound, k, 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 k. So let's put it together. M, I, l, k. M, I, l, k. Milk. Looks like a funny way to spell milk, but there it is. Milk. Milk. The next word, we're going back down to a 3-letter word. Beta, epsilon, gamma. Beta is a B sound, epsilon is an S sound, and gamma, unless it has something else that's following it that you need to pay attention to, is a G sound. B, E, G. B, E, G. Beg. Beg. So we have someone who's begging for milk, or something like that. I don't know. Alright, the next 4 letters. The last letters were like their English counterparts, except that you had to skip J. These ones are a lot like their English counterparts, except that this time you're going to insert a random X sound. So after M, you'd expect N-O-P. L-M-N-O-P. N-O-P. But right after the N, you insert the Greek equivalent of X, and it's called xi. Xi. But other than that, it's basically the same as N-O-P. But instead, they of course have different names. The N is called nu, and it has an N sound as in the English word, new. Nu. Now the thing that I find that is the most annoying about nu is that its lowercase form looks like a V. It does not sound like V. It looks like a V though, but it does not sound like a V at all. Nu. It is very annoying. But with time you get used to it, and there's another Greek letter that does not look like what it is as well, but you get used to it after a while. So what looks like a lowercase v is actually an N sound, and the letter is pronounced nu, and it makes an N sound, n. And then, like I said, right after that you're going to insert an X sound, x, xi. It sounds like the X in axiom, xi. And then after that you have omicron, and it sounds like the O in not, which is actually a little bit annoying because omicron and alpha basically have the same sound. Alpha is ah, omicron is ah. It's basically the same thing, which is really annoying. So alpha and omicron effectively have the same sound. Ah. It's an ah sound as in not or father. And then we have P. Now most of you guys out there who know your math would know this as pi, but it's not pi in the Erastian pronunciation. It's P, which is kind of funny in English, but you know, we'll go with it. And it does have a P sound, as in peach. Pa-pa-pa-pa-pa. Peach. P. Does not look at all like an English P though. It is written very differently. Alright, so now we have some new words to pronounce at the bottom. The first one is a 3-letter word. The first letter is nu, then eta, and p. Nu eta pi. Nu has an N sound, N. Eta has a long A sound, A. And then P has a P sound, P. So, sounding this out, we get N, A, P. N, A, P. Nape. Like nape of the neck, nape. Carrying an animal by the nape of the neck. Right. Second word is a two-letter word. However, it involves that X sound, and that X sound can be a little bit difficult sometimes. But we have, as far as letters are concerned, we have omicron and we have xi. Xi. Omicron has an ah sound as in not, ah. And then xi has an X sound, x, x. So when we sound it out, we get ah, x, ox. Ox. You know, that beast of burden. Ox, from which we get our steak and hamburger. Ox. So we get nape and ox. Alright, the next four letters I call the after Qs because they're basically exactly the same, or at least correspond to their English counterparts that come after Q. Greek alphabet doesn't really have anything that corresponds to Q, but the letters that come after Q do have a correspondence. After Q in English, you'd expect Q, R, S, T, and T, and then U. And that's basically what you have in Greek. The first one corresponds to R. It doesn't look like an R. It looks like a P, but it actually corresponds to R. The second one corresponds to S. It looks just kind of strange no matter how you look at it, but it corresponds to S. And then the one that corresponds to T actually does look like a T, which is kind of nice. And then the last one corresponds to U, although it doesn't actually sound like a U. It's kind of an interesting sound. Alright, so the first of these letters that come after Q, or at least would come after Q in the English alphabet, is called Ro. And it sounds like the R in rod. Ro, rod. Ro, rod. Ro. It's a confusing letter, kind of like the nu is. The lowercase nu looks like a V, but it's not a V. It's an N sound. Here, this looks like a P, but it's not a P. It's actually an R sound. But you get used to it after a while. So when you see this thing that looks like a P, it's actually an R sound. Rod. The next one is kind of an interesting one just because of the different forms that exist in. The capital form looks kind of like a messed up E in the modern version of Greek. However, if you look at an ancient manuscript, you won't see that capital. Instead, the capital that you'll see actually looks like a capital big C. And it kind of helps explain why there are some words that in English will be spelt with a C, but that C actually makes an S sound. For example, in the English word conscience, all but the first C actually have S-type sounds. And that's because along down the line, they're basically derived from sigma, which is an S sound, as in study. Now, the lowercase sigma, which is the one that you need to worry about for reading through an edition of the Greek New Testament, exists in two forms. Their first form, which looks like an O with a little line that's coming out from it, that form is the one that exists pretty much anywhere in the word it wants to, except for the end. When you get to the end of a word, though, if you need an S sound there, you don't use the O with the little line. Instead, you use something that looks kind of like a regular S that we would have in English, except the bottom part of the S is made small and it drops below the line a little bit. So it's kind of like a C with a tail almost. And that is just for the end of words. So O with a little line, basically anywhere in the word that it needs to be except for the end. And then C with a little tail goes at the end of the word, and they both make an S sound, as in study. It's sigma. So we have Rho, we have sigma, and then the third one down is tau. Tau. And it has a general T sound, just like you would expect in English, like in talk. Ta-ta-ta. Talk. Tau. And then last but not least is one that is hard to pronounce correctly. Technically, it's supposed to be a German U sound, not a regular U sound. The best rendition of it that I can do is upsilon. That's about the best that I can do. Upsilon. However, most of the time it just comes out sounding like U. And that's about as close as I can get. And that's probably about as close as I would expect anyone to get. It's kind of like the English U, but it doesn't actually sound like U. It doesn't sound like the short U sound, as in up. It doesn't sound like the long U sound, U. Instead it's U, upsilon, upsilon, which is just kind of weird. Alright, but we have some more words to try out here. The first one is tau upsilon beta. Tau upsilon beta. Tau has a T sound, upsilon has an U sound, and then beta has a B sound. So when we sound it out, we get T, U, B, T, U, B, tube, as in a tube of toothpaste. Tube of toothpaste. Tube. The second word has quite a few letters in it, so this one's going to take a little bit longer. The first letter is the general form for sigma, this form of sigma that occurs everywhere but the end. Then we have tau. Then we have alpha. Then we have rho. And then we have the end form for sigma when it happens at the end of a word. Sigma makes an S sound. Tau makes a T sound. Alpha makes an A sound. Rho makes a sound. And then sigma again is an S sound. S. So when we sound it out, we get S, T, A, S. St, A, S. Stars. 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 Like stars and stripes. So we get tube and stars. Alright. The next four letters I call the E omegas. And that's because the first three end with an E sound, or an is sound if you wanted to use the short form of iota. But E omegas. And then the final one is omega. And that's actually the last letter of the alphabet. So we're almost done here. We just got 4 more to go. And a lot of times when we transliterate these ones come out with double letters. The first one is phi. And it is usually translated PH, but it sounds like F, as in phone. Phone. And then the next one is ki. And it sounds like the CH in lock. It's a hard C sound, lock. You know, gotta get your best Scottish accent on there. Lock. The Loch Ness Monster. You know, has a hard C sound. It's not like a typical CH sound that we have in English. And this is why, even though we spell, say, the word Christ with a CH, we don't actually pronounce it as a normal CH. We don't say ch-rist, we say Christ. It's a hard CH, it's a hard C sound. It's not an actual CH sound in English. So we say Christ, not Trist. Trist would be a very strange pronunciation indeed. Alright, and then the next one is psi, and this one is always hard to pronounce. It sounds like the PS in lips. Ps, lips. Psi. And this one is put in bold just like xi was, because this one is actually 2 other Greek letters basically put together. This one is P and sigma put together. Psi. And when you put it together, it sounds like the PS in lips. Ps. And then finally, we get omega. And it's a relatively simple sound. It's just a long O sound, like tone. O. Omega. Alright, so let's go ahead and try to sound out some words that use these. The first word that we have is 3 letters. We have phi, omega, and nu. Phi has an F sound to it, f. Omega has a long O sound, O, and then nu has an N sound, n. n. So we have f-o-n, f-o-n, phone, phone, as in the telephone. Alright, next word is 4 letters. The first letter is ki, not chi, ki. Then we have rho, omicron, and then psi. Ki has a hard C sound, k. Rho has an R sound, r. Omicron has an ah sound, ah, a short O sound, ah. And then psi has a PS sound, ps, ps. So let's put it all together. Crops, 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 crops. Like the kinds that you would sow in your field, crops of corn, crops of wheat, harvesting the crops. So we have phone and crops. I'm not sure what the sentence is that would connect those two. Phoning people about how your crops are doing? I don't know. Something like that. Alright, so here is the entire Greek alphabet, and I've left some of them as links for you guys to fill in. So we have alpha, beta. Do you remember what the next one was? Think about it. In English, we'd want a C to be there, but in Greek, there is no C there. There are some letters that sound kind of like C, but there is no actual C letter. You guys remember what it is? It's gamma. Alpha, beta, gamma. And then we have delta, and that ends the primaries. And then we get the etas, and they start with epsilon, zeta, eta, and then what's the last one? Starts with a TH kind of sound, th, th. So epsilon, zeta, eta, theta. Theta is the last one. Epsilon, zeta, eta, theta. Alright, and then we get into the skip J's. It's just like it would be in English, except that Greek does not have the letter J. So you have iota, you skip J, and after J in English, what would you expect there to be? You'd expect there to be a K, but what is it called in Greek? Kappa. Iota, kappa, lambda, mu. Iota, kappa, lambda, mu. Right, and then we go into the insert X's, and it's a lot like it would be in English, except that you insert the X sounding one. So you have nu, and then right after that you insert the Greek letter that corresponds to X. Do you remember what it's called? Xi. Xi. It's like kappa and sigma put together. Xi. Nu, xi, omicron, p. Nu, xi, omicron, p. Right. And then we go to the after Q's. They basically correspond almost exactly to what you would expect in English following the letter Q. Q, R, S, T, U. So the one that fills in for R is rho. The one that fills in for S is sigma. Then there's tau. And what's the last one? Doesn't actually really sound like U. Upsilon. Upsilon. And then the last 4 are the E omegas. You have phi, T, and then what's the next one? Psi. Psi. And then omega. And that is the Greek alphabet. See, that wasn't so bad. Go through it a few times, try to sound out some words with it. Also go through and try to write English words with the Greek alphabet using the same sounds. Don't try to necessarily do a one-for-one correspondence, but try to use Greek letters to make something that sounds like English words. That's fun, and it helps you get an idea for how the different letters sound. Alright, section 2, the rough breathing mark. The rough breathing mark is pretty simple. It's basically an apostrophe that's put above a vowel. And when that happens, you basically pretend that there's an H in front of the vowel. So what we have right here is omicron with a rough breathing mark above it. So instead of pronouncing it as ah, which would be omicron by itself, omicron, you instead pretend that there's an H in front of it, so it becomes ha, ha. Okay, so basically the little forward apostrophe means that there is essentially an invisible H. It's not actually on the page, but you pronounce it as if there was an H there. Now there's also lots of other breathing marks and other kinds of marks that occur in Greek, and some of them just help you distinguish between words and that kind of thing, and all that sort of stuff. But this is basically the only one that you need to really pay attention to, is the forward apostrophe, the rough breathing mark, because it actually changes how the word is pronounced. So here's a couple of words that use the rough breathing mark. The first one, without the rough breathing mark, would be amartia, amartia, amartia. Now we account for the fact that there is a rough breathing mark there, so we put in the H sound, so it becomes hamartia, hamartia, hamartia. Like in hamartiology, this is the root word for hamartiology. Hamartiology is the study of sin. Hamartia is basically the Greek word for sin. Technically, it refers to forfeiture or deviation. And it's actually a pretty general concept. For example, in the Old Testament, it talks about people who would not miss the mark when they were throwing things. They wouldn't deviate from their target. And it says that basically that they did not hamartia, they did not miss, they did not deviate. So anytime you deviate from what you're supposed to be doing, or what your goal is supposed to be, it's hamartia, it's deviation, it's sin. It's forfeiture of what you would otherwise have. The next word, without accounting for the rough breathing mark, would be uper, uper. But with the rough breathing mark, it becomes hooper, hooper. And this is where we get the English word hyper from, and it basically means above. It actually can mean a few different things depending on context, but the basic meaning is above. So when you say that someone is hyperactive, what you're saying is that their activity is above that which it normally is. Hyper, hyper, hyperactive. Their activity level is above what it normally is. Hyper, above. Alright, section 3, Greek diphthongs. Diphthongs are basically vowels put together, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a look at that. Alright, Greek diphthongs. You have there are quite a few of them. Alright, first diphthong, alpha, iota. When you have these two together, it makes a long I sound as in aisle. And a fairly important word and a very common word in Greek that has this diphthong in it is kai. Kai is a conjunction, means it connects clauses together, and it is usually translated as and. This goes with that, this and that. However, it can also indicate that two things are being very closely associated, such that they both or more things point to the same concept. So for example, when Jesus in John 14:6 says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, those are actually in Greek all connected by kais, which says that there's a very close connection between them. You could translate it as I am the way, even the truth, even the life, saying that all three of these things are supposed to be pointing to the same ultimate concept, and that's kind of the idea. The way, also the truth, also life, these kinds of things. It means that they're all pointing to the same thing. There's an overarching concept that they all tie into. Next diphthong is epsilon iota, and it has a long A sound, kind of like eta, or the EI in eight, A. A fairly important word in Greek that uses this is ekon. Ekon, which you probably will not recognize with that pronunciation. However, if I change the vowel sounds a little bit, you'll probably recognize it immediately. Icon. Icon, it means image or likeness. Icon is an image or a likeness. For example, in Colossians 1:15, Paul refers to Christ as being the image of the invisible God. The word that is behind that translation image is icon, image, likeness, imprint. The next diphthong is omicron iota, and it has kind of an oi sound, like an oil, oi. A fairly important Greek word that uses it is oikos. Oikos literally means house. However, it more frequently, or at least very frequently, refers not so much to a structure as it does to a familial relationship to a family. So it's more like household in a lot of contexts. For example, the church, the assembly, the group of people that belong to God, that are believers, that worship together, are referred to as the essentially the oikos of God, the household of God. The next diphthong is alpha upsilon, and it has kind of an ow sound, as in sow or kraut, ow. An important Greek word that it shows up in, and it's very frequent in the Greek New Testament, is autos. Autos, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, basically acts like a third person pronoun. Basically he, she, or it, depending on if it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. So autos, he, she, it. The next diphthong I like because it is actually a word by itself, and it's the only diphthong in Greek that I know of that is actually its own word. And it is omicron upsilon, which kind of has a double O sound, oo, kind of like the oo in soup, oo. And it by itself is actually a word, oo. And it is a word that basically means not. It has a few different forms. For example, you could say it as ook. That's one of the forms that it shows up in, but just oo by itself still means the same thing. It basically means not. That did not happen. You did not just say that. Not. The next one is a little bit of an interesting one. It doesn't show up all that often, but it's still fairly often. Upsilon iota has kind of a wee sound. Wee, 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 wee. Like in sweet. Wee, 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 wee. Sweet. An important word that it shows up is one that uses the rough breathing mark. And when a word that has a vowel diphthong needs to be pronounced with an H in front, the rough breathing mark goes after the full diphthong. So upsilon iota is the diphthong, and so the rough breathing mark goes at the end of that, so it goes with the iota. So this one needs to be pronounced with an H in front of it, so it's huios, 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 huios. This is the Greek word that is very often translated as son, as in phrases like son of God, son of David, son of man, those kinds of things. However, it's a very general term at the same time, and it doesn't necessarily mean son like we think of in English. When we think of son, we usually think of a biological relationship. In Greek, though, that wasn't necessarily the idea. The idea was much more so that these are both things that have some kind of a quality or traits or substantial identity that is the same. So, for example, you could refer to someone as a son of the prophets, meaning that they were like the prophets. They were doing what the prophets were doing. They filled the same role. They filled the same shoes. A son of David is someone who fulfills or fills in the role of David. But also at the same time it could just be simple derivation, not necessarily biological, but it could be simple derivation. For example, Adam is referred to as being a son of God. This doesn't mean that he was the biological son of God. It means that Adam was made by God. He derives from God. God made him. So it's actually a pretty general word, but it's usually translated as son. And then last but not least is a diphthong that actually occurs in two forms but basically has the same sound. And this is the one that is either epsilon upsilon or it's eta upsilon. And it actually is one of the few ones that actually does have a proper U sound, but it's the long U, so it's a feud. It's not the short U like in up, it's a long U like in feud. An important word that it shows up in is euangelion. Euangelion. Now, you might notice that when I'm pronouncing this word, that the first gamma I don't pronounce as a normal gamma. Instead of saying euagelion, I say euangelion. I pronounce it with an N sound. And that's because with gamma, if it's followed by another gamma, or it's followed by something that sounds like a C, it should instead be pronounced as an N. So that's why I'm doing that. So it's euangelion, not euagelion. Euangelion. Euangelion. This word is the word that is usually translated as gospel, and it literally means good news or the proclamation of good news. Now, this word is usually very severely corrupted when it's transliterated into English. When we take it into English, the upsilon we make into a V, so we would pronounce it as evangel, or evangelist, or evangelical, because we put a V in there where the upsilon is. But it refers to the good news, spreading the good news, things like that. Alright, Greek punctuation. Let's take a look at Greek punctuation. In Greek, there are actually a few different punctuation forms. If you're looking at the ancient manuscripts, the ones that you would want to know the most of would be ones that are used for nomina sacra, ones that are used with numbers and things like that. However, most of those things don't apply to modern versions of the Greek New Testament. Modern versions of the Greek New Testament have things like lowercase letters in them. They have fairly standardized punctuation, all these things that make reading it so much easier. And so a lot of those other concerns with nomina sacra and all those kinds of things we're not going to get into here. We're just going to talk about the ones that normally show up in printed editions of the Greek New Testament. And there are only 4 punctuation marks that are commonly used. So those are the only ones that we're going to look at. There is the Greek comma, which is basically the same as the English comma. There's the Greek period, which is basically the same as the English period. And then there are 2 marks that are just kind of strange. First one is a raised dot, and it behaves a little bit more like an English semicolon, or sometimes it'll act like a comma that's right before a quotation. It represents a little bit harder and faster separation, and is sometimes used with quotations and those kinds of things. And then there is what looks like a semicolon, but it is actually functioning as a question mark. So the first 2 are pretty straightforward. Comma is comma, period's a period. However, raised dot means semicolon, and semicolon means question mark. It's weird, but that's just the way it is. It's the way it turned out. And after a while, you get used to it. Section 5, Greek syllabification. How do you actually separate all of the syllables out? That's what syllabification is. In Greek, vowels go with the consonant which precedes them and not the consonant which follows them. Unless the following consonant is a final letter, or there is another consonant after that, double consonants have to be split, or the consonants is xi or psi. Both of those letters are basically double consonant letters, and so they often get split up. Alright, so what does that actually look like? Let's take a look. Alright, so here are some Greek words that we're going to go through and split up. And when you're splitting them up into syllables, I would suggest that you look for the vowels first. Alright, so in our first word, our very first vowel that we encounter is alpha. And the alpha does not have anything that precedes it, which tells us that it is going to stand alone. So our very first syllable is just alpha by itself. Let's go to the next vowel, omicron. Omicron does have a consonant that's in front of it. That consonant is gamma. So gamma and omicron are going to together form the next syllable. So we have alpha and then gamma omicron that form the next syllable. The next vowel after that is another alpha, and in front of it is rho. So rho and alpha are going to form the next syllable. And then the last vowel is omega, and in front of it is zeta. That's the consonant. So zeta omega is going to make the last syllable. So this is actually a 4-syllable word. Agarrazo, agarrazo, agarrazo. And it's a verb that basically means I buy something. Alright, now this next word, we run into a little bit of a difficulty. The first word, agarrazo, was nice because we had vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant. But in this next word, we get a double consonant, sigma theta, and we also get a double vowel, iota omega. Okay. Double consonants need to be split, and double vowels, unless they're part of a diphthong, they also need to be split. Okay. If it's part of a diphthong, you can put the vowels together, and you should put them together, but iota omega is not a diphthong, and so they need to be split up. Alright, so normally we would have the epsilon, the first vowel, by itself, because there's nothing that precedes it. But since what follows is a double consonant, we need to split those consonants up, so the sigma is going to wind up going with epsilon. So our first syllable is epsilon sigma. And then the next syllable is fairly normal. You have iota there, that's the next vowel, and it always has the consonant that precedes it, which is theta, so that's pretty normal. Theta iota is the next syllable. And then omega is not a part of a diphthong, so it can't go with the iota. It's going to stand on its own. So this is estheo, estheo. And it is a verb that basically means I eat something. And you have to have something out in there to say what the something is. So estheo, I eat. Alright, the next word goes back to the vowel, consonant, vowel pattern, which is nice, except that one of those consonants is a double consonant. Xi. Xi is a double consonant. And so when you pronounce it, you're going to split the xi up. Xi is basically kappa and sigma put together. So kappa is going to go on the front, sigma is going to go behind it. So your first syllable, instead of being epsilon, it's epsilon kappa. And then your next syllable will be the rest of the xi and the next vowel. So sigma alpha. And then the last syllable is pretty much normal. You have that last vowel there, omega, and the consonant that precedes it, the gamma. So gamma, omega, that's pretty normal. So that word is exago, 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 and it means I lead out. Which is also where we get the English word Exodus, when the Israelites were being led out of Egypt. Exago, I lead out. Now, these first three words were all vowels, and you'll notice a pattern here. They all ended with omega. That doesn't hold for all of these words were verbs, and they all ended with omega. And that doesn't necessarily always hold, but very frequently, vast majority of the time, if a word ends in omega, more than likely than not, it's a verb. So that's kind of a useful pattern to notice. This next one does not end with omega. That doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't a verb, but in this case, it isn't a verb. Let's take a look at it. In this one, we have a couple of problems. We have a double consonant letter, psi, and then we also have two vowels next to each other, iota and omicron. We're going to have to split up those two vowels because those two vowels are not part of a diphthong. If it was in the reverse order, omicron and then iota, it would be part of a diphthong, oi. But this is not a diphthong, so we're going to have to split those up. And then the double consonant letter we're also going to have to split apart. And the double consonant for psi is p and sigma. So when we split it up, we get apsias, apsias, which is the Greek word for evening, apsias. And it is a noun, apsias. Alright, so that is how you separate Greek syllables out. Hopefully that made sense. And if not, There's not a whole lot that I can do with a PowerPoint presentation, so good luck, I guess, maybe, I don't know. Alright, section 6, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 20. I'm going to do a little bit of translation work here. Alright, Galatians 3, verse 20. There are two clauses, and so I made it into two lines. The first clause is ha de mesetes henos uk estin, which makes so much sense to you, I'm sure. And then the second clause is ha de theos heis estin. Again, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense just yet. So let's go back through and let's start translating. So going back up to the beginning, to the first line, the first Greek word is ha. And the reason why I'm saying that it's ha is because it has a rough breathing mark above the omicron. So instead of just the ah of omicron, you have to put an H in front of it, so it's ha. And ha is one of the forms of the Greek deterministic relative pronoun. Basically the Greek definite article. And what this is telling us is that there is a noun phrase that this either signifies or that is going to follow. And it turns out that there is a noun phrase here. Okay, so we know that a noun is coming up. But before we actually get to the noun, we have a conjunction, de. De is a very important conjunction that you need to pay a special attention to when you're translating. Because de implies that what is being said here is a part of an ongoing conversation. Whenever you have de in a verse, it means that it is connected to preceding material. That is, you have to understand what was said before you get to this point in order for this to make sense. This is somehow related to that. Very important for exegesis. Whenever you're trying to understand a verse in Greek, if it starts out with de, it means that there's something else that came before that you need to know. So we know that there is, at this point, a noun phrase that's coming up, and we know that what is being said here is related to some larger context. It's a part of some larger discussion. And then the next word is mesetes, and that is actually a noun. But Greek nouns are a little bit weird. You see, Greek actually started out as a primarily verbal language. You pretty much said everything with verbs. And then as time went on, from those verbs they started developing nouns. And so Greek nouns are such that they're actually defined by what they do. They're not defined by what they are, they're defined by what they do. And so with some Greek nouns you can actually translate them in terms of what they do. And it'd actually be a perfectly correct translation. So even though it's a noun, the individual translation of that word might actually come out as a verb, and that's fine. So looking at what we have to start off with here, the ha de mesetes, well, we have some things that are a little bit jumbled up. First of all, the de is the conjunction. In English, we don't put conjunctions after the definite article. That's just weird. We don't put it in the middle of our noun phrases. Instead, that's how we begin our clauses. So de, when we translate it, it needs to go at the beginning. And it needs to imply somehow to the reader that what's being talked about here is related to something else. And so I've translated it with the English word now. Now this and that, something that implies that there's something that came before this. Okay. That is very important for translating that. It implies that there's something else that was there. It's part of some larger discussion, some larger discourse, some larger narrative. And then the Greek definite article ha, or you could call it the deterministic relative pronoun ha, could be translated in actually a multitude of ways. The general way that I like to think of it first is the phrase that which is. A lot of times where you see this word, you can put in that which is, or some form of it. Sometimes you have to cut off the is, sometimes you have to cut off the that, or change it up a little bit, but some form of that which is usually a sufficient translation for it. In this case, I cut off the is, that which. And then we get mesetes. Mesetes is a Greek word that basically means mediator. There's a little bit more to it than that, but it basically means mediator. And so in this case, like I said, since Greek nouns are defined by what they do, you can put what they do in place of the noun. So instead of and saying, and the mediator, I'm going to say, now that which mediates. And so that is the noun phrase. And then we get into the rest of the sentence. And the rest of the sentence has a very different order from English. There's just 3 words that are left for the rest of the clause. There's henos, which is the genitive form, well, a genitive form of the Greek word one. Henos basically means one, but since it's genitive, that tells you that there is some kind of possession or derivation that's involved, and when that happens, you can usually put the English word of in there. So it wouldn't just be one by itself, it's of one. And that will wind up going at the end of the clause. Then ook can stay in the middle there. It's a form of u, which just means not. We already talked about that before. And then the last word is actually the verb of the clause. It is estin, which means is. So henos ook estin, if you rearrange it and put it in the proper order, is not of one. So the first clause in Galatians 3:20, literally translated, is now that which mediates is not of one. Now that which mediates is not of one. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense in English, but nonetheless that is the literal translation. That is a very formal translation. These are the Greek words, this is what they translate into, that is what it is. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that is a formal translation. And at this point it should be clear that there are some issues when you translate that way. Just because you know what all the words are saying doesn't necessarily mean that you know what the entire clause means. And especially with this one, remember there's that de in there that means this is a part of a larger discussion. In order to translate this in context and actually get useful meaning out of it, you have to know what the rest of Galatians 3 is talking about. But before we get into that, let's get into the second clause. So the second clause, we have something that tells us that there is a noun phrase for the second clause. We have ha again. And we also have de, which means that this is a part of this continuing conversation, a part of this continuing discourse. So we just said this one thing, and now here's the second thing that's related to it. And de can sometimes continue a thought, and then sometimes it can contrast with the previous thought. And in this case, it's contrasting with the previous thought, so I've translated it as yet. And the ha, this time I've decided to translate as the English definite article the. Like I said, you don't actually have to translate it that way. In a great many cases, you can do it as just some form of that which is. But there are also cases where you can do it as the as well, and you won't necessarily lose anything. Then the next word is theos. And in most translations and most beginner classes, they're going to have you translate theos as God. And that's not necessarily incorrect. But there is kind of a mismatch in that when we think of the word God in English, we almost always think divinity. We almost always think deity. However, theos in Greek, and as it was understood at early times, didn't necessarily always imply deity. It is a title that could be given to deity, but in and of itself, it didn't necessarily make deity. Instead, the basic idea behind it is that you're referring to someone who is great. Great in a status, someone who's great in power, but there is this idea of greatness behind it. So I've chosen to translate it as Great One. So, yet the Great One. Yet the Great One is the noun phrase. And then we have the rest of the clause. And we're looking for the verb of the clause here, and it's found at the end of the clause just like it was in the first case. And it's estin. Estin, we've already seen before, it basically means is. And then we also have heis. Heis means one, but unlike henos, which also means one, heis is not in the genitive form, it's nominative, which means it's basically just one by itself. You don't have to put the of in there. It's not of one, it's just one. So, yet the Great One is one. Alright, so let's take a look at what it reads like now. Now that which mediates is not of one, yet the Great One is one. Does that make a whole lot of sense? Probably not. In order to make sense of this, you really need to know the rest of the context. you need to know what came before. There's a reason why Paul, when he was writing this, or his scribe that was doing it for him, whoever was responsible for the text itself, put in the de. That de that begins the verse, ha de, indicates that this is a part of a larger discourse, and you need to understand that discourse in order to make sense of this. When you go back and you read Galatians chapter 3, prior to verse 20, what it's talking about is the law. And it says that the law was given through intermediaries. And Paul is making the argument that you cannot be saved through the law. That our ultimate redemption, our ultimate reconciliation with God, does not come from the law. It comes from Christ instead. That is Paul's argument. And this is a part of that argument. He's just said that the law has been put in place through intermediaries. And then he goes on to say here, now that which mediates is not of one. What does he mean? Well, henos, or heis, depending on which form you want to talk about it, doesn't necessarily always mean numerically one or cardinally one. It often refers to unity, and particularly to the unity of a household. And this is actually something that Paul picks up in Galatians chapter 4. He talks about us as being adopted sons of God, being brought into the family of God, as it were. And so here, the of one part doesn't necessarily mean numerically one. Instead, it's more so talking about the concept of unity. So when he's saying that that which mediates is not of one, what he's saying is that if you have a mediator involved in something, it indicates that those two groups or more, those two or more groups are not unified. They are not brought together in one oikos. They are not one household. They are not reconciled. They might be able to get along to a certain extent. They might be able to manage to coexist to a certain extent, but they are not fully reconciled. They are not fully united to each other. Okay. That whole idea of heis, henos, mia, that oneness is not necessarily oneness of number, oneness of cardinality. It's usually oneness of unity. For example, when Christ quotes Genesis and says that for this reason man shall leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. When it's talking about the one flesh there, it's basically the same Greek word. It's a little different form of it, but it's basically still the same Greek word. And the oneness that's being referred to there is not necessarily a oneness of personhood. You still have two people. You still have a husband and a wife. They're still two separate persons, but they are of one thing that belongs together. They are one oikos. They are one household now. They are a new household now. And that's the same concept that Paul is talking about here. If you have a mediator involved, there is an implicit separation. They might be mediating to some extent. They might be able to work some things out. They might be able to coexist. But if you have a mediator, you do not have complete reconciliation yet. And Paul says that this is a problem because of the nature of God. This is what the next phrase is about. Yet the Great One is one. What does Paul mean? He means that the very nature of God is one of unity. That God desires unity. That God is actively reconciling us to himself. And Paul's argument is that this is through Christ. And this is what Paul talks about in, say, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We now have reconciliation through Christ. The law does not reconcile. The law points to the need for reconciliation, but the law in and of itself does not bring about ultimate reconciliation. Ultimate reconciliation is only found in Christ. That's what Paul's argument is in here. Now, a lot of people, when they read Galatians 3:20 in a fairly literal translation, they look at that last phrase, yet the Great One is one, and they think that it's talking about the nature of the Godhead. It's actually not talking about the nature of the Godhead. It's talking about God's desire for unity with mankind. And a lot of groups will actually take this way out of context, and they'll come up with some very strange doctrines and theology based on it. Unitarians, modalists, oneness Pentecostals, those kinds of groups will sometimes abuse this verse because they don't look at the rest of the context. And this is something that you guys need to be very careful in when you're translating Greek. Pay very special attention to those conjunctions. If it has a de in it like this one does, ha de, it means that this is a part of a larger discussion that you're not going to understand without looking at that broader discussion. And this is where we also get the difference between formal translation and what is called dynamic translation. Formal translation is what we just did. Now that which mediates is not of one, yet the great one is one. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense in English. Those are basically Greek words that have been translated into English and put in an order that makes sense in English, kind of, but it still doesn't mean a whole lot. You have to a certain extent, not just translate, but also interpret. And so what follows after that is a more dynamic translation that tries to get at the heart of what is actually being talked about here. You could say that the presence of a mediator implies a lack of unity, but this is a problem since God's nature is one of unity. That is, He is the all in all. That is, His fundamental nature is one of unity. And so here's a problem. So these would both be considered translations of Galatians 3:20. One is very formal. These are the Greek words put into English. The other one is very dynamic. This is what that would mean in its context. And this is the basic difference that you get between a lot of translations that are out there. Some translations are formal, some translations are dynamic. Formal translations are sometimes very hard to understand because things that are said in English directly from the Greek don't always make a lot of sense. Now, the danger with a dynamic translation like you have in the second part is that relies on the translator's ability to correctly identify what is going on in the context. And frankly, translators can get things wrong, and you guys in translating can get things wrong. And you need to be aware of that. If you're not sure which kind of translation to do, whether to do a formal translation or a dynamic translation, it's always safer to go with formal. And the reason why is that a formal translation, even though it might not make a lot of sense, the nice thing about it is that it puts the responsibility back on the reader. That is, it's the reader's job now to figure out what this means. When the reader reads, now that which mediates is not of one, yet the great one is one, they're probably going to be a little bit confused, and so a good reader, a reader who takes their job as reader seriously, is going to go back and look at the context leading up to this and see what's going on. If you decide to do a dynamic translation and try to give your reader a better understanding of what that verse is, within itself, you are basically doing a certain amount of interpretation for the reader. And like I said, your interpretation could be wrong, it could be right. If you're pretty sure that you're right, and the formal translation you don't think is sufficiently clear, you can go ahead and do it a little bit dynamically. But like I said, it's always safer to err on the side of formality because that puts the responsibility back on the reader rather than you as the translator. If you misinterpret something but you leave it as a formal translation, somebody else will be able to see what it is. If you misinterpret something and you do it and you decide to translate dynamically, you're limiting down the possible interpretations to the one that you picked, and that can become a problem. There are reasons why people do dynamic translations, is because formal translations don't always make the most sense, especially if you take them a verse at a time or something like that. Okay, so there are reasons for them, but there are also dangers on either side. A formal translation may not be very clear. A dynamic translation can be very clear, but it could be flat out wrong because people interpret it incorrectly. Okay, and so that's something to keep in mind when you're translating. Formality versus dynamic. Where is the responsibility? Are you taking on the responsibility as the translator for interpreting this, or are you putting the responsibility on the reader? That's a bit of an issue that you have to work out. And then also, while we're at it, there is one last kind of translation that's out there, and that's called paraphrastic translation. Paraphrastic translation has two basic goals in mind. The translator will have one particular thing that they're trying to communicate throughout the entire text, and paraphrastic translations are also meant to be very easily understood. That's why you paraphrase. You make it into something that's easy to understand. So paraphrastic translations typically oversimplify things because they want it to be easily understood, which is a problem if you're dealing with a complex subject. You've oversimplified it. It doesn't have all the nuances that it used to have. That's a problem. And Paraphrases, like I said, have one overarching goal in mind. And if you happen to be in a passage that doesn't necessarily talk about that one overarching goal, then the odds are that people are going to try to tweak it to point to that overarching goal, and you'll wind up making it say something that it didn't say. And because of that, paraphrases are very problematic. They usually do exactly what they're meant to do. They get across some certain point, and they're easy to understand. The problem is that they oversimplify things, and they force passages to say things that sometimes they don't. They were never meant to say. So as far as the safety with which to translate Scripture is concerned, it's always safest to stay with formal translation. If you are sure of what the proper interpretation of that formal translation is, and you think that the formal translation by itself isn't going to be sufficiently clear, then you can do a little bit more dynamic. Definitely want to stay away from the paraphrase, though. That would be my suggestion. Anyways, thank you guys for listening. I know that this has been kind of a long one, but hopefully you guys are able to get something out of it, and I hope that you've learned to be somewhat cautious in your translating, if nothing else. Go with God and be blessed. Amen.